Thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to this month's Co-op Conversations. My name is Marc-Andre Pigeon, or Marc-Andre Pigeon. I am the director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Co-operatives. And before we begin today's conversation, co-op conversation, I want to acknowledge that we're coming to you from Treaty 6 territory. And that means that, for me anyway, it means that I try to live in relationship with the nations that were and are parties to this treaty and similar agreements. So here in Treaty 6, that means the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. And living in relationship means, at least from my perspective, that we have a responsibility to each other, make sure our children, grandchildren, and all the way down the line have access to good drinking water, clean air, food, a predictable climate, and a roof over their head. And that last piece is really, in some ways, what this talk is about. It's about that shared responsibility we all have as treaty people and beyond to ensure kind of universal access to good quality and affordable housing. And it's hard to be a good neighbor when you don't have a place to live, a place you feel attached to, or a place you proudly call home. So with that in mind, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today. We're going to talk about co-op housing and its cost and other factors, starting with Nick Falvo. Nick is a Calgary-based research consultant with a PhD in public policy. He has developed and taught one of Canada's only university-level courses on affordable housing. And recently, Nick was awarded the 2021 CMHC President's Medal for Outstanding Housing Research. Nick is joined today by Greg Suttor. Greg is a semi-retired housing policy and research consultant. He has 30 years experience as a research and policy advisor at municipal and provincial levels of government, the Wellesley Institute, and as an independent consultant. And Greg is the author of numerous research and policy reports, including the evocatively titled book, Still Renovating: A History of Canadian Social Housing Policy. And last but definitely not least, we have Courtney Lockhart, who is the Associate Director of Public Affairs and Policy at the Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada. And in her role, Courtney develops policy to support the growth of the nonprofit cooperative housing sector. Most recently, she was a part of a team that saw $1.5 billion announced in budget 2022 to develop a new cooperative development program, the first in 30 years, and something I paid very careful attention to last year when the budget came out. Before we hear from Nick, Greg, and Courtney, a word on our co-op conversation series. Over the next 15 or 20 minutes, thereabouts, our featured speakers will share some of their findings. And then we're going to have a very short conversation. That would be me and the speakers. And then we're going to break people out into groups around a question that Nick, Greg, and Courtney have prepared for us. And we're going to try and set aside about 15 minutes or so for those conversations. And the reason we do that is because we hear repeatedly in our conversations that co-ops really value, and people who are interested in cooperatives really value the opportunity to network. And these breakouts are meant to kind of make some of that happen, to be enriching to you as individuals, but also from the perspective of any organizations you may be part of. Lastly, before I turn things over to our speakers, if anyone is experiencing technical difficulties, you can message Stan Yu. And Stan, can you just wave to folks?
Hi, everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stan. Stan will be able to assist if you want to send him a note in chat. He can kind of help you there. Finally, we will be recording this session and we will be sharing a link to the event once we've kind of done the processing after the event. So probably early next week. So we'll be emailing that link to all those who are participating in today's call. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Courtney, Nick, and Greg, and off you go.
Great. Thanks so much, Marc-Andre. It's nice to be here. Nice to see everybody, see some familiar faces and new faces. As Mark said, I'm Courtney. I work at the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada, and we are a member organization representing housing co-ops from across the country. About 2,200 are across Canada in every province and territory, which is about 250,000 people. And we were really pleased to release this report last year, comparing housing charges, rents in co-ops with rents in similar private rental buildings. Many Canadians know about renting and owning, but there's an alternative that not very many people know about, is cooperative housing, which is collectively owning your home. Co-ops are strong, they're caring communities. co-ops are affordable, they're secure, and we call all of this the co-op difference. We're always trying to tell people what's the difference between renting and cooperative housing. And we wanted to do this research to prove one of those proof points, I guess, that there's a lot of benefits. And one of them, we knew a lot anecdotally about the difference between co-op housing and how it remains affordable over time. And we really wanted to dig into the numbers of that. So it was really great to work with Nick and Greg, and they'll get into the details in just a minute. And just to give you a little bit broader context, as Marc-Andre said, we've been working with the federal government, CMHC, now on a new development co-op housing program. It's the first program in over 30 years. So what we're really focused on is developing a new generation of co-op housing. Our members, the folks that live in co-ops across the country, have put forward a bold vision of co-op housing for all to significantly develop more co-op homes across the country so that we can play an instrumental role in addressing the housing crisis. So that's a little bit of the context of what we were up to and why we want to do some of this research, and we're happy to be here. And I'll turn it over to Nick now to start getting into some of the details.
Thanks, everyone. Really honored to be here. The way this started was I was talking to Courtney and her colleague, Dallas Alderson, probably just over a year ago. And with me being a research consultant and then being at the Co-op Housing Federation of Canada, we were talking about, or I guess bouncing around ideas on research projects we might do together. And I said to them, I said, I've seen past research showing that social housing broadly, now known as community housing, including co-op housing, tends to keep rents low over the long term compared to comparable units that are privately owned. I've seen it, but it's old. I think the last time I saw research was like 20 years ago. I don't know if it included co-ops. I said, why don't we use some co-op data, looking at rent levels over time, compare them to private sector apartments, privately owned apartments over time, and see how the gap changes between them, or see how the levels change over time. I suspect we'll find that co-op organizations are keeping rents a lot lower than the private sector ones over time. And so I quickly wanted to put together a team. And so I reached out to Greg Suttor. Greg, who's going to be doing most of the talking today, he's my longtime housing policy mentor. I've known him for over 20 years, and he's helped me a lot over the years and helped mentor me. And I reached out to him first to help us. I said, we need your help, Greg. Can't do this alone. He was interested. And then he said, we need someone who's strong in data also, like somebody who's really good in Excel, somebody who's fast in Excel, somebody who knows how to write all those formulas out in Excel. The ones I see other people writing all the time. And so we reached out to a guy named Shidam Atowu, who's not on today's call, but because he's traveling today, but he did a lot of the Excel work for this project. And so together we formed a team. Greg and Shidam did more of the work than I did, but it was an honor to play a small role. We also benefited enormously from help from Courtney and Dallas, because they were in touch with us along the way at various junctures, helped us acquire data, gave us helpful feedback along the way, helped teach us a lot about co-op housing. We also benefited from the Agency for Cooperative Housing, particularly somebody named Natasha Morrison there, who made the co-op rent data available to us. And we benefited from CMHC because they did a custom tabulation of private rental unit for private costs, private rents. And then when it was time to negotiate a price with CMHC, because you usually have to pay them for special custom tabulations, we asked if they'd consider giving us a discount because it was Co-op Housing Federation of Canada. And they said, not only can we give you a discount, but we're going to make this available to you for free because what you're doing is totally congruent with the National Housing Strategy's objectives. So the data is yours for free, surprise. And so that was nice too. So we put a great team together. We had great cooperation. And without further ado, I'll let Greg Suttor do the remaining of the talking.
So thank you, Nick. So let me just make sure we're on the right slide. I guess we could go to the next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So our theme and the title of the research report is the co-op difference. And so just to frame the presentation here, let's consider what underpins the co-op difference in rental housing. And it's about a nonprofit business model versus a market-driven private landlord business model. The top row of this chart here, won't go into this too much, right? There are differences at the point where a co-op's developed and in its early years of operation. That's not our focus here. If you look at the middle row, right, there's a different long-run financial model and trend. A co-op, once you're 30 years down the line, well, once you're, let's say 20-ish years down the line, the mortgage is pretty modest compared to market rents. And, once you're 35 years or whatever it is down the line, the mortgage is paid off. Now, there may be some refinancing for major repairs. But meanwhile, private rental, in most cases, rents just escalate to what the market can bear. There may be new buyers who need new mortgages to pay those high rents. The existing owner may refinance to give themselves capital to invest elsewhere. It's a very different business model. And so then the bottom row, so then we expect, and anecdotally we know, that there's a very different kind of long-term rent trend, with co-op rents being lower. And the question, as Nick said, underpinning our research was, well, how well does this play out in, documented experience? So that's what this is about. And the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is about mature co-ops, as we call them, right? So they're 20 to 40 years old at the midpoint of our study period. That study period is 16 years, 2002 to 2021. And so as mentioned, we have this detailed rent data, anonymized, made available by the Agency for Co-op Housing. We compare those co-op rents to market rents. And this is the Canada Mortgage and Housing Rental Market Survey that's done every year, just released last week for this year. It's a custom tabulation, broken out by unit size and zone of the city and all the rest of it. We analyzed these 5 cities. This is comprehensive data. It's universe data. It's not just a sample. It's 7,900 co-op apartments and 7,500 co-op townhouses. And the private rental universe is just over 500,000 units in 2021. And so the next slide, please. So just now some highlights of our findings. First, apartment buildings. Mature co-ops were always well below market. Here we have the average of the 5 cities. They start off around 25% below market rents, at about, that is to say, at about 75% of market rents on average, and they subside over the study period to 33% below market. And then the next slide, please. And now townhouses, right? They're also well below market, 30 to 34% below market. Over time, there's a bit of a decline, a softer decline vis-a-vis market for townhouses than apartments. But nevertheless, that gap is there and that gap is expanding. And just briefly, what underlines these trends we've underlies, these trends that we've seen, co-op rents were rising by about 2 to 3% annually, right? So kind of just an inch ahead of inflation. Market rents were rising by about 3 to 4% annually, with more fluctuation, but markedly higher. Once you're over, add that up over 15 years, it's a big difference, as we'll see in a minute. Other next slide, please. Sorry, I need, my note is out of order here. So this adds up, as I just mentioned, to a huge gap over time, right? In the absolute difference in monthly rent paid. Typically, in the early years of our study period, it was about 200 a month. I mean, different cities, but generalizing about 200 a month. And then it rises in the closing years of our study period to $500 to $600 a month. Typically, now it's a much higher gap in Vancouver in particular. And then the next slide, please. And so we have this for each city, right? We have this data in great detail in the report for each city. Just a quick visual summary here, and on the next slide, we'll just stay on this slide for a sec. In most cities, you'll see an accelerated rise in market rents in 2015 to 2019 as conditions really sharply tightened, as I'm sure many of you well know. You know, we saw a surge in market rents, those are the black lines on the graphs, but no such surge in co-op rents, right? Because they're not market driven. And so that gap of co-op rents widened notably in that period, but it widened, you know, gradually and over the whole study period. And then the next slide is the same, except this one's Vancouver and Edmonton. This is Toronto and Ottawa. We also, of course, have Victoria not shown. Next slide, please. So we did consider other factors. You know, we just compared the universe, right? Because the universe of experience it matters, but we also controlled for some things, right? Two factors that are highly correlated with rent levels are age of buildings. Older tends to be cheaper. Some exceptions in, you know, gentrified, you know, stuff, but generally older is cheaper. And secondly, location within the city, the zone or district of the city. Is it inner or middle or outer? Is it up market or down market? And, you know, co-ops have a very different age profile from a private rental. 60% of all co-op apartment units were built between 1975 and 89, the heyday of the programs, versus 75% of private rental apartments in Canada were built before 1975. But if we just look at co-op and private rental of the same age bracket, 1975 to 89, we find much the same trends as you've just seen for the universe. You know, the differences will be, you know, a bit higher or lower by city. There's some differences, but you've got the similar trend and similar big gap below market. So the next slide, please. And so this is my concluding slide. You know, so the broader implications, the benefits of the nonprofit business model are what we're really seeing in operation here, right? Long-term rent levels based on, you know, what it took to amortize the mortgage and the cost to operate the building and do some major repairs, not maximizing rent revenues and asset values based on what you can get in the market. This is also the long-term payoff for public investment in the early years of each co-op. And, you know, public investment is needed to cover the very high costs of a new co-op, right? You can't build a new co-op and cover the cost at $1,600 a month rent or, you know, $1,200 a month rent or something like that. And also, you know, these findings are quite relevant to other forms of mixed income social housing, such as community-based nonprofits. And the findings are also consistent with prior research and with international experience, which Nick and I are familiar with and which we gave a brief summary of in the report. So that's the summary of the findings. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Greg, Courtney, and Nick. That was wonderful and so much food for thought. We are going to go into a breakout in just a minute, but before we do, I do have one kind of question that's burning in my head. And Greg, you kind of alluded to this in the last slide. If you did this study with other forms of nonprofit housing, would you find the same results, do you think? And if, depending on the answer to that, where do you see any differences emerging from the co-op model itself relative to other forms of social housing? So yeah, if you can just kind of explore that idea a little bit, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say.
Sure, Nick may want to add something, but I'll start. I would distinguish between mixed income social housing, right, where a lot of people are paying a housing charge or rent that's a market rent, not a private market rent, but it's a market rent nevertheless, right? So that's that's certainly co-ops, and it's most kinds of family and seniors nonprofit housing, right? But if you look at public housing that's all low income, if you look at Indigenous housing that's usually all low income or very low income, if you look at supportive housing, for people with various disabilities, that's usually all low income, right? That's a different kettle of fish. But if you're talking about mixed income, community-based housing, co-op or nonprofit, then much of the same, trends and differences will apply. Could go into it more. That's kind of that's the first response there.
Anything you want to add, Nick or Courtney? Not to put you on the spot. You don't have to add anything.
I'll just add briefly that when you're for-profit entity, you have a clear interest in raising rents as much as possible, as much as the market can bear, unless maybe you feel sorry for a particular tenant, exceptional circumstances like that. When you're a co-op or a nonprofit entity or a public entity, you're not allowed to make profits. So that's kind of the crux of all this, and that's why you see similar results from other forms of community housing have been obtained over the years.
Courtney, anything you want to add?
I just want to add the context too, that this report was only looking at the rents. There's also the other part that makes co-ops mixed income. So the subsidies that the co-op will receive from the federal government or provinces or municipalities. So you have those kind of trend lines. You can also get the other information about the subsidies, which we didn't do in this report, that would show deepening affordability as well.
Right. And there is this overarching question of the cooperative governance that's sitting in the background that arguably differentiates these housing arrangements from other social housing arrangements, mixed housing arrangements, private housing arrangements, that democratic control. Is that something that you kind of, I'm not sure how you would account for that in your study, but is that something you've thought about a little bit in terms of framing this out, that governance part of things? I don't know who wants to tackle that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it's often the first question that comes up of like, why, how do co-ops set their housing charges? Because, our normal assumption is that you have a landlord who's taking some profit, and then you have the renters who's paying the bill. But there's this other element of how it's collectively decided, how the budget is maintained, how the co-op needs to democratically make decisions about saving money and for capital repairs, things like that. Like it's super central to how they operate. But we've shown, like, this is the evidence as well, that co-ops, because they're acting in that collective way, they are values based as well. So they are dedicated to keeping housing charges low and keeping the building in good repair. You can kind of do both. Right.
Fantastic. Anything you want to add, Greg or Nick? And again, you don't have to. We can jump through things.
I'll add a comment. Yeah, that in the early years of a co-op, when it does need a subsidy to break even, to be economic, the rent levels tend to be very driven by program rules. But in the what we're calling the mature co-op, where it can certainly break even and pay its remaining mortgage below market rent, then you've got these strategic choices at the level of the individual co-op and at the level of the sector. To what extent are you pursuing the objective of kind of moderate below market rents, and there's lots of people with income levels that need that, right? To what extent are you, charging a bit higher than that so you can pay for major repairs, or charging a bit higher than that so you can contribute a few dollars to a new co-op, So there are these strategic choices that come up that have to be decided upon in the democratic governance structure of co-ops.
Yeah, that's a really rich thread to explore. And I think I'm gonna kind of cut short this part of the conversation, and we're gonna go to the breakouts, and thank you all of you for that. So this is where we hear from you, because again, these are our conversation series are meant to kind of bring kind of neat research ideas to the table, but use that as an excuse for people to kind of network a little bit through these breakouts. Because you're probably going to land in a group that you don't know everyone already out the gate, we would ask you to just begin with some introductions, who you are, where you're from, where you work, what you study, that kind of thing, and what brought you here today. And then we're going to ask you to think about a question that Courtney, Greg, and Nick asked us to share with you, and that is, and Stan's going to put this in the chat. We often try new ways to communicate the co-op difference. How do you experience this in your field? How can we push the co-op model into the mainstream rather than being seen as an alternative? So a nice big broad question that I think leverages the research that we've just heard today. And that's what we're going to ask you to engage in after you've kind of worked through some of the introductions. So Stan's going to break us out for about 15 minutes. We'll regroup at 12:40 and then we'll wrap things up. Stan, can you break us up, please? Welcome back, everyone. I hope your conversation was as invigorating as mine was in our group. Really had a lot of good chat and made some good connections. That's what this is all about. Now we have an opportunity to have a kind of plenary conversation. So I did see some comments in chat, but I do want to kind of, and they seem to have disappeared. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and hopefully one of us will catch you and you can unmute yourself and ask it, or you can post it in chat and I'll try to monitor what's going on there. Chris, go ahead.
Question to maybe any of our speakers or folks who have something to add. I know in the past, the CMHC through a program, I think it was the Community Resource Organizations program, kind of provided funding to resource groups to really facilitate, getting people together to start new housing cooperatives. And of course, development is, an expansion is really kind of key to conversations right now about housing co-ops. I'm wondering, is anyone kind of aware of, conversations going on with CMHC or kind of in maybe this, Courtney, this is to you with your advocacy at CHF around, what does support for maybe resource groups look like, and how we can, create some of those like scaffolding structures and mechanisms to really kind of facilitate, the development of new co-op housing.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And one of my colleagues was just telling me about the history of CHF Canada. Like we started as an organization basically to do that, to work with CMHC when the co-ops were first started to help, build from the grassroots. It's definitely a question that we're having with this new program of basically how much money do you need for admin and support and all of that. The one thing I will say though that's different kind of this generation versus the old generation in the 80s was where development now is happening is like united cooperative models. So we have a new co-op in Nova Scotia, for example, which is called Compass Nova Scotia. And the housing co-ops in Nova Scotia tend to be pretty small, like maybe, I don't know, under 20 units. And a bunch of them got together over the past 6 years or so with a vision to develop and try to kind of pool their assets. And they have a vision to develop, like maybe redevelop their sites or, buy property and redevelop across the province. So they're now like a province-wide cooperative. And that's where we see this kind of development of community knowledge, development expertise, all that sort of thing. That's kind of where it's happening right now.
Wow, super interesting, Courtney. And thanks for the question. I should note Chris is very knowledgeable about student housing co-ops. He lived in one and devotes some of his time to thinking about that history. So he was in my breakout group. So I just want to flag that. And also Chris and Jillian, the other person in my breakout group, have both read Greg's book. So that was nice to see as well. Any other questions on this? I really love that thread though. That's a really cool idea. Anyone want to jump in? Hand raise or in the chat if you want to throw something.
Oh, one other thing, Marc-Andre, we were talking a little bit about Quebec before this started, and Quebec still has these resource groups. They were not underfunded or stopped funding like the other parts of the country. So Quebec still has these groups. Okay, so the province has been supporting some of that activity. Is what's happening in Atlantic Canada also supported by the province, or is it emerging from the co-ops themselves entirely, or CMHC at some level? Yeah, it really was co-op led, but yeah, now the province has really gotten behind it and seen that it's a model that's working, and yeah, there's different programs now and openness to support that type of development. Wonderful, love that scaling up. Dion, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, just two really interesting comments that came up in our group. One, I think it was Natasha Morrison, who brought up sort of that there's other kinds of, in addition to the economic benefits that were raised in the presentation, that there's other kinds of social benefits to belonging to a co-op. And we were talking about thinking about, could there be research about sort of like the design of co-op housing, like there's more spaces for communal kinds of activities that in other private kind of apartment buildings. So that was one thing that I thought was really neat, because we know in other spaces where we try and think about the co-op difference, sometimes the economic case is more difficult to make, I think, in this than in this space, but there's like sort of that other aspect that might be kind of sellable to people in terms of thinking about living in the space. And then I think Greg made also a really great point about, because I was sort of thinking about could you encourage more people to want to be in co-op housing, but there's like sort of this idea of that, like there might be life cycles too, right? Some people might sort of be in co-op housing for a while, and then they actually they might aspire to own their own home or something like that. And that living in co-op housing could be sort of a way that they could save more money for a down payment or that kind of thing. And that all of those kinds of approaches are okay, right? But that, how do you change also norms around co-op housing? Because I think that's where, you know, some of the space might be for sort of growth, but that, you know, it's not, still the majority of people in Canada are homeowners. And so thinking about sort of the group you're thinking about and what their needs might be at any point in time.
Any reaction, Greg or Courtney or Nick, to what Dion just said?
I'll add a comment. You know, we had a little small group discussion of this. With the high price to buy a home these days, there's just so many youngish adults who are renting and looking for better options, and that's much more of a reality now than it was 20 years ago in Canada. You know, middle income renters, mostly younger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's a great question though, because those types of values are like maybe soft outcomes. They're so important to the co-op identity that, you know, we hear from our members and why people love co-op housing. There are folks that do research on this. We're part of, I'll just put a link, Professor Rebecca Schiff, who's now at the University of Northern BC. She leads this research group that's doing a bunch of work. I think one of her students did a master's last year and studied a co-op in Thunder Bay and like the social and health outcomes. So there are lots of those questions out there, but we definitely need to do some more research about it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Courtney. Maria, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to build on that. I spent many years as a co-op manager and really getting to know people who lived in the co-op. And, you know, it's interesting because that does happen where, you know, a young family or a single mother moves in with a lower income. And, you know, the neat part about being able to use housing as a vehicle to develop people is you can watch that process of somebody come in, maybe struggling, but because they have that affordable housing, they're able to go back to school, they're able to save for their mortgage and eventually move out and build a better life. But the other thing that happens that's really neat is the amount of people that stay in co-ops. And so, you know, watching people who maybe moved in the 80s or 90s, raised their families there, you know, grew these little co-op youngsters who maybe moved away or maybe got their own unit within the co-op. And then a huge need we're finding for development now is based on, because these people are still in their 2 or 3 bedroom townhouse from raising their family, now they're finding they're not as accessible, they're needing options so they can age. And so we're looking at, you know, how can we use the land or the resources to develop seniors cooperatives so they can stay in their own communities and their own co-op homes.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maria. Great stuff. I see Isabel is up next. Before I turn to you, Isabel, I just want to point out that in the chat, Chris has shared his email address. If you're interested in student housing co-op, reach out to him. And Courtney has shared a link to something as well in the chat. So Isabel, over to you.
two things. I've got a question for Courtney, but also a bit of a response to Dion. We're at CUSAR are doing housing research funded by SHIRC CMHC and as part of a national partnership grant. And we are looking at, not exclusively at co-op housing, but co-ops are included in the housing we look at. And we are looking at a range of social benefits as well as the economic. And my question for Courtney is you know, we were asked to think about how we can have new strategies for communicating the co-op difference. And I was thinking, you must have learned a fair bit in your work with the federal government to get that policy investment and to get a major reinvestment in co-op development. I wonder if you could say a bit about that. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. It's the landscape, I will say, has changed. I've worked at CHF Canada just about five years now, and it's totally different from when I started. I think the pandemic had a lot to do with that. People really became aware of their community and what was around them and who lived close by to them, and realized, you know, that ending homelessness is possible. This isn't something that we need to have in our communities. So I think there's a huge shift that way as well. Like politically, all the parties, no matter what party, they care about what their voters are saying to them, and everybody's talking about housing. And so I feel like every solution's on the table a little bit again. And so the reason why we put together this report is to kind of package it to say, you know, this is the model, this is how it works, this is what you're investing in, you should invest in more. All the parties care about that and want to find solutions. The tricky thing now is, like, we do have to frame it as it's this economic model, but it's also a way where we need to build our cities differently. So, like, can we do them with energy efficiency? We want more non-market housing close to transit, right? So we're building cities where we can, start reducing our GHGs and all those things. So you have to ask for money for investment that's going to do multiple things. And the co-op model does that. So it's just a lot of education.
Thank you, Courtney. I see Scott has his hand up. Go ahead, Scott.
Hi, great report, really interesting presentation and discussion. I had a question about, well, my mind kind of jumps to what are the mechanisms or avenues for expanding the co-op sector, in particular in urban areas, in the city of Toronto, for instance, where we haven't seen a lot of new co-op units come on stream in a little while. And, I hear a lot about new builds, but I was wondering as well about acquisitions. So acquiring existing private market buildings as they come up for sale and kind of co-operatizing them. I was wondering if anybody had heard of any precedents for these, any options, any discussion, or just any ideas. Thanks.
Who wants to try that question on? Courtney? Nick?
Oh, I'll just start briefly, and I'll turn it over to Greg. That acquisition is hugely important, especially when you're talking about the context of the whole rental market. Like, that we know that there's relatively affordable rental housing stock that's in the private market that's continuing to become more and more expensive, or it's being sold. And so if we can have co-ops and nonprofits acquire that, that will just help, the numbers across the country of how many rental housing units we have. So it's something that we talk about with every level of government. The province of BC just 2 weeks ago just created a fund for this. So I check that out. It's going to be organized or managed by the nonprofit, the co-op, and Indigenous housing organization collectively. So that's something we'd love to see across the country.
Very cool.
Let me add that there's just a lot of, oh, sorry, Mark.
No, go ahead, Greg. No, go ahead.
There's a lot of precedent for that. That there were many co-ops in the 1970s and 80s, early 90s, even formed by groups of tenants, facing usually some issue with their landlord, but, and with the assistance of sector organizations and resource groups, and programs that supported this, managed to buy their building or, townhouse complex or whatever it was. There were loads of examples in numerous Canadian cities, and it's been an important part of, and it remains a necessary part of the strategy in my view.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Courtney. We have time for one more question. I do note in chat, maybe I'll get Courtney to respond in chat to the question that was posed here about the name of the organization so that people can kind of track it down. I'll go to Dion for one last question, and then we're going to wrap up. Go ahead, Dion.
Just circling back to a question Marc-Andre asked earlier, and maybe the presenters aren't the right people to ask this, or maybe so, but on the governance challenges, I am really interested in knowing how these co-op housing organizations, how they're governed, and if there's any major kind of challenges that stand out in the governance model.
Who wants to take a crack at that? Courtney, does that feels like it might be a you question, but I don't want to put you on the spot too much. Do you have a thought?
Yes. Sorry, I was just finding the link. We were talking about this in my breakout group a little bit, of the why the model matters and maybe some of the challenges. My colleague Maria actually is on. I don't know, Maria, you work a little bit more closely with co-ops directly than I do.
Yeah, I sure do. And actually, this is a point of real interest to me is thinking about the vision for cooperative housing for all and how do we develop in the next 20 years. And a lot of it is around, a lot of the conversation is around governance solutions. So it's looking at, we have this great model and things about it work so well and we really believe in it, but there have been challenges with governance over the years. And so how do we start changing that conversation? And so part of that, there's a whole host of different pilots that are starting up and different solutions available. Some of it is through amalgamations, working together in new, interesting ways through unified co-ops. Land trusts can really provide some solutions to the challenges governance is having with housing cooperatives. There's a whole host of solutions and not a one size fits all model. There's no one answer to this. It could look like a lot of different things, and it's a conversation that my colleagues and I are eager to have.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Greg, for a wonderful presentation, helping spawn a really great conversation as well. Just before everyone runs, I want to alert you that our next co-op conversation is always the first Wednesday of every month. We're going to have our own, one of the Center's fellows, Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, is going to talk to us a bit about the important role that Black women have played in the U.S. cooperative movement. I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation. She's a wonderful presenter. If you can join us. I also want to let you know that we're actively doing work around renewable energy cooperatives here at the center. And we have a talk coming up on February 15th. Again, a bit from a diversity perspective and looking at how renewable energy cooperatives are embracing diversity or not, and what they can do to address that. So for any of our upcoming events, just go to our website, check it out, sign up, and join us in the future for other conversations. Thank you all for engaging today, and have a great rest of your day.